Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to a new tournament game analysis video. Today we're going to be covering the final game in the April Excelsior tournament. So I was playing against a candidate master, Adnan, and I was playing with the black pieces. He opened up with the move d4, so I ended up playing d5, and after the Queen's Gambit, we actually go into the Slav defense. Knight to f3 was played, knight to f6, and then we see e3. Now, if you are familiar with the Slav, you would know that this is probably the most testing line in all of the Slav defense. Why do I say that? Well, this still has the option to transpose into a lot of different variations, but it also gives black kind of a question that they don't want to answer, which is, are they going to develop their bishop on f5, or are they going to trap it in with a move like e6? And I played e6, and I think that this is totally fine, but lately, over the past couple years, this move has been a bit more difficult for black to play without having some sort of problem with their position. Instead, the move bishop to f5 is the more popular choice at the moment, and the whole reason behind this is that when you play something like knight to c3, you can finally play e6 as black and get this nice structure with your bishop out of the pawn chain, but white does get something for it, which is after something like knight h4, bishop e4, f3, bishop g6, and something like queen to b3, they have pressure on the b pawn because this bishop has developed away, and they also are going to be getting the bishop pair at usually some sort of cost, like playing something like f3, but usually white's pretty okay with this, and it's actually a big reason why I'm not enjoying the Slav as much as I used to. This variation has put a lot of joy out of playing these positions. But after e6, there's a lot of ways to continue. My opponent ended up playing for b3, where I go for knight to e4. This is a pretty common variation. The whole point here is that it's actually difficult to try to suggest a specific move. For example, if you play a move like bishop to e2, you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do against bishop to b4 with check? But you're almost forced to play something like knight on f3 to d2. The whole reason is that if you play something like knight b1 to d2, there's knight to c3 winning the bishop pair. This is actually a massive deal for black, and black is quite happy here. And again, this is also the same story. So knight f to d2 might be the best move, but of course, undeveloping a piece like this is just really not something we want to do generally with the white pieces so early in the game. Instead, the move bishop to d3 was played, which is quite common. I played bishop to b4 with check. Again, it's just an important move to play. It develops with check, and there's not the move c3 in response. So it's always something that should be considered in these types of openings. So we see knight bd2, and I played knight to d7. This is actually a very important idea here because you don't really want to castle quite yet, and you don't want to play something like f5 quite yet because your opinions or your options might actually change. The big reason is right now, if we do something like castles, moves like knight to e5 and then knight to f3 might be playable, and this is not really ideal. Same thing with something along the lines of castling and then threatening to capture. Maybe we actually wanted the knight already on d7. So again, there's a lot to consider here. Now after knight to d7, it makes sure that something like knight to e5 is just a lot less harmful because that's very important here. And we see castles and now f5, again avoiding castling because it's more important to make sure that there's not some sort of weird blockade, especially with a pawn getting to e5. White ends up playing a3, and now here's a question. Do we end up taking on d2, or do we retreat? And how do we retreat? So taking on d2 is just not the way to go, first off, because after taking, knight takes on d2, and castling, white's going to be playing the move f3 and soon can play a move like e4. And here's just a sample variation given by some strong engines. Rook f7, a4, a5, bishop to a3, knight to f6, c5, queen c7, bishop to b2, knight d7, rook a to e1, and you can't really do anything here as black. The only move that we really want to play that looks pretty human is e5, but this is just horrible thanks to e4. The entire center gets blown up, meanwhile black has barely developed their queenside. So this is just a no-go. So of course we're going to be retreating, and of course bishop to a5 is not going to be the way to do it, because this just helps white further their pressure. After bishop to c7, b5 is already playable. So bishop to d6 is played, and we're actually quite happy with this. It might seem like c5 is a good option here, but it turns out it's not as good as allowing something like b4. Let's see why. So c5 was played in the game, and now we go bishop to c7. And we're already seeing that it might be a little bit difficult for white to get some sort of pawn break. Usually they want to go b4 and b5. But instead, if they go b4 here, b5 is pretty much already prepared. Castles, bishop to b2, queen f6, throwing in a move like g3 is really important, just because it makes sure that there's no weird sacrifices or crazy attack here. And after a move like g5, b5. And it turns out white's actually incredibly happy because black can't really do too much about the tension in fear of this bishop getting opened up, especially if we're trying to play with a closed center. And you can think of this a lot like the king's Indian defense. Usually black wants to keep the center closed for a bit and go for a kingside attack. And if the center opens up, this could really hurt black because they're the ones pushing the pawns in front of their king. So objectively, I had a chance after c5. Bishop to c7, b4, queen to f6. I was just waiting on castling just for a few moves. And after bishop to b2, I played g5 here. And I probably shouldn't have. This is the point to actually castle. It's a pretty good move. And now we're ready for moves like g5 and g4. And the reason why is it actually has to do mainly with this diagonal. If instead we play g5 like I did in the game, now bishop takes e4 is playable. Where after f takes on e4, they can go knight to e5. And I have to do something here. If I end up taking on e5, then unfortunately after takes, I have to play a move like queen to g6. It's very important to not allow the move queen to h5 check. And now I can play the move f3, which causes me some problems. Now, I want to castle here because if I don't, then the f file will likely get opened up. But if I do, then unfortunately this e4 pawn will just be incredibly weak. And it's not like I have a good way to attack their e5 pawn or something like that in return. So this just spells a lot of trouble for me. I end up taking on f3 because this is pretty much forced. And after rook takes on f3, I played the move bishop to d8. And I had an idea in mind. The whole point here is that I'm looking for a move like g4 and developing this bishop on this diagonal, because right now it's quite passive. And my opponent didn't really do anything about that. They actually did have the option for knight to b3 here, and it's quite strong. The whole point here is that if I go g4 here, it's a little bit different. We're after rook to f1. Eventually, they're ready for moves like knight to a5 at some point if I end up developing this bishop, or they could even play a move like knight to d4. But really, everything is incredibly flexible for them, so there's not really a rush. Whereas for me, it's kind of hard to find some good moves now. If I develop with something like bishop to e7 to try to castle long, then knight to a5 all of a sudden is a little bit stronger because there's no bishop takes a5. But the problem is queen to b3 was played, and this is directly a problem for white because now knight to b3 is impossible, and that is ideally the square you want to put the piece on. So I continue on with my plans of g4, and then we see rook f6. And I was kind of shocked by this move, not gonna lie. But at the same time, I recognize that this isn't gonna be worse for white. So I need to be a bit careful. I think you have to take on f6. If you do anything else, then that's just gonna be trouble because you're letting white double up on the f file. But after taking and taking on f6, there's already a threat, which is f7 with check. If white can play that, they end up winning back that exchange and opening this diagonal, and this is really bad because they'd actually be winning a piece, not just winning back the exchange. So I played rook to f8. Castling is also definitely an option here. But I didn't think anything was too wrong with rook f8. Rook to f1, and I played h5. So white had the option to play e4 here and this is just a nightmare. If I end up taking it, for example, they can go queen to e3. They're going to regain this pawn back, and this is just awful because d6 is just permanently weak. This is really bad. So of course, taking it doesn't really make sense. But if you don't take it and you play a move like queen to g5, which looks quite natural, it's just a slight improving move, e takes on d5. And you have to ask yourself, what are you going to be doing here? Because taking on e6 is a threat. You could just give up the entire knight because this king on e8 is just way too weak. So you should likely take back. But after something like c takes on d5 and then queen to d3, white doesn't really have to do anything, but there's already so many threats. There's potential queen b5's in the air, queen h7's in the air. And what does black do? Maybe a move like bishop to d7 is best, but it really feels really difficult to play. So it's hard to actually give any good moves here. So queen c3 is still good. It's just not as good as e4. But after h4 and then rook to f4, I played king to f7. And now all of a sudden, white has to be a little bit more accurate. And it's not so hard to be. And the move queen to e5 is incredibly important here, mainly because you're threatening to infiltrate with a move like queen to c7 check. And black is forced to just make more and more moves that just feel a little bit passive and strange. For example, rook d8 looks like the most natural way to defend against queen c7, where now there's rook d7, but all of these pieces are just completely locked in. I can't move this bishop without undefending my rook. For example, like I'd have to play something like b6 maybe. There's just it's a bit too abstract to find out how to develop any part of the queen side. So this is just not going well. But instead, knight to b3 was played, which gives me a perfect opportunity to play queen to g5. Queen h5 also is good, but we need to prevent queen e5. And it turns out queen e5 was played anyways here, but this is a big mistake. Now after queen takes e5, bishop takes e5, and rook to g8, black's actually the one that's doing well here. Remember, we are up the exchange, so now we're actually able to make something of it. Knight to c1 was played, and I played a5. So b6 is just much better, and again, the goal is just to develop the pieces at this point. b6 allows bishop to a6 or bishop to b7, and after a move like b5, it's still, we need to be careful. If we take on b5, then all of a sudden moves like knight to d3 actually offer a ton of activity, and black has to be incredibly careful here. You can imagine this bishop ending up moving, for example, bishop d6 and knight e5 checker, potential threats, but right now, yeah, you just don't want to take with this pawn. And turns out you actually can take with this one, though, because the whole point is after a move like knight to d3, it's good having a pawn on c5, because now rook g5 is playable. The whole point is that if you take on c6, c4, and white's going to be losing something here now. But with a5, they actually have an interesting sacrifice with b5. And the whole point is, again, just making sure that these pieces don't get in the game. If they do, then white is just completely lost. So I took on b5, knight to d3, but went bishop to d7, and then they went h3. So again, this makes things a little bit more complicated. This position is just all over the place. But here, objectively, black has a nearly winning position, actually just a winning position. After g takes h3, rook takes h4, and there's two ways to win. There's rook takes g2, which is what I played, but there's a better move. There's rook h8. And the whole point here is this is pretty much forcing the rooks off the board. After rook g4, we can go rook a to g8, and after rook g7 check, we can take, go rook h5, and then b4. And all of a sudden, there's just too much going on for white. We're not really too worried about this pawn. The rook has been developed. This bishop has been developed. And because they cannot take this pawn on b4, we're creating a passed pawn as well. So everything's working in tandem with each other, and black should go on to win quite easily. But instead, I took on g2, which means that rook h7 check will almost always be possible, and this is really bad. After king to f1, I had to be super accurate here, and of course I wasn't, because this move is pretty nuts. I played the move rook to d2. But it turns out that the move king to g6 is actually totally fine for black. The whole point here is you're going to f5. So knight to f4 check. Of course, this is one of the moves that you look at and realize, oh, this just doesn't look good. But after king to f5, if they take on g2, you're able to take back with check and then take on e5 and look at the remaining material. Black is actually ahead 4 points, a bishop and a pawn. So this would be winning. But it's really hard to play a move like king g6 voluntarily going into a check. So yeah, that's something to definitely watch out for. Instead, with rook to d2, now there's knight to f4. I go rook to f8, trying to hold everything together, but rook takes h3, rook a2, rook h7 check, and things are just going to fall apart from this point onward. Unfortunately, I made the last mistake. So king to e8, knight to g6. If I go rook to f7, then there's rook h8, followed by a checkmate, with rook takes on f8. So I took on a3, with the hope that maybe they take here, and then I have a bunch of pawns, maybe can do something, but I know it's lost. Rook e7 check, king to d8, and then we see knight takes f8, just taking my full rook. I ended up not resigning quite yet because I was hoping that, for example, already with rook takes d7 and then king d7, just hoping, or king to e8, just hoping for something like this where maybe there's some sort of tricks in the air. Even then, it looks like bishop to d6 might be playable, defending the knight, which defends the rook. Very, very interesting. So, yeah, that's important. But also, even still, then black gets to play d4. That's what I mean. Black has a lot of pawns. So I didn't feel like it was quite time to resign, especially because we were both playing such a messy game, and it doesn't feel even clear to me at this point without using any engines. So knight takes on d7, rook to f3 check, king to e2, rook to f5, and at this point I kind of realized that there's just no coming back. But I just hold on for one extra move, and the whole point here is if they play a move like f7, I can now take on e5 and then take on e7, and these pawns are going to create some problems for white. So that was one goal of mine. But then the other one was after bishop d6, a4, f7, a3, knight b6, I go rook to e5 with check. Now, of course, they can take it, but I was kind of hoping for that because after I take this rook, it feels like they have to be slightly more accurate. They just have to be a little careful because I can go b4, b3, and maybe b2. But actually, yeah, it's just nothing here because they could go king d2, which is exactly what they do. And at this point, I decide to resign because, well, they're threatening rook e8 check, followed by promoting, and they're also just threatening to promote. So I need to go rook f5, but again, rook e8 would just be a checkmate here. So yeah, pretty crazy game from start to finish. Interesting rook sacrifice as well. I had chances of my own to win, but the position was anything but easy. So yeah, just kind of a funny game to look back on and think I hate the Semi-Slav so much because these e3 positions right from the opening. If you play e6, you're not happy. If you play bishop f5, you're not happy. I'm just not happy here. So if you guys have any suggestions on potential openings that I should switch to, please let me know because I'm thinking of switching something here and I'm not fully decided either. So that's going to be it. All right. Thanks for watching, guys.